Welcome back, all you truth seekers. My name is Candy Smith with co-host Sarah Stein. We're back at it again. Welcome to Holistic Meets Education Podcast. And today we have another amazing episode for you all. We will be really diving into the pandemic, mental health, and kind of what that looks like overall for children and families and how it affects them. So we know with the pandemic, a lot occurred, a lot of changes happened because of the pandemic. And whether we want to believe that or not, it truly had a massive effect on children. So I'll even start speaking for how it affected me in the pandemic. So, of course, going through the pandemic, having to be a single parent, taking care of two children by myself in the pandemic at home, pretty much being the teacher, the principal, the nurse, everybody. Even though they were going to school online, I still had to sit with my youngest son and make sure he was on task and he was doing those things that he was supposed to do. Not only that, I had to cook, right? So I was a cafeteria worker as well. I was a gym teacher as well. We still had to go outside and, make sure he was getting his daily exercise. And so when you're placed in a situation where you're on lockdown and you have to stay inside a home for so long and you don't have that social interaction, you have that uncertainty, you don't know what's going to take place, it can really truly affect you on a mental level, emotional level as well. And it kind of dictates how you start to behave, how you start to act. And I saw those things with my youngest son. It definitely caused him to begin to act out in ways that I had not seen before. He started to have meltdowns. He started to have tantrums. Even though he kind of had them before, it was almost like it heightened it. And even with my oldest son, he's a social butterfly. He enjoys being around, other children, his peers. And it really kind of made him almost like a hermit, I noticed. So today, we just want to, of course, bring that awareness to the pandemic and how, again, it heightened the mental health.
Absolutely. And along the lines of what Candace was saying, so for me personally, as a tutor, I experienced this as well, both working with the children and, speaking with their parents and their guardians. And it's definitely been an interesting time for a lot of people. And I think one of the most difficult things for individuals and families was the fact that because of this quarantine, not only were you, for the most part, kept in your home or inside, you sort of were left to kind of mull over and focus on everything that you might have kind of pushed to the side in the past. So this goes both for like parents, children, because prior to the pandemic, I think a lot of humans just in general tend to go from one thing to the next. And we, as a whole, don't spend a lot of time sort of in reflection or just thinking about what is really at the surface, like what are we actually feeling? And so I think having this downtime, as many people call it, during this pandemic, a lot of us were sort of forced into a space where we couldn't hide from these feelings or situations that we had, right? Because we were really spending time at home with each other and of course with ourselves. So that is definitely something that, has been a challenge for a lot of families and children. And like Candace was saying, right, a lot of families had to take on the role of multiple people, right? The teacher, the chef, the gym teacher, right? All of these things. So there was definitely a lot of, pressure on the families, and that affected their mental health too, which is a separate situation. But of course, the children, they had to, there's this like readjustment phase, right? When we go from, one stage of life to the next. And I think for a lot of children, even going from a dynamic of being in a school, in a social setting, seeing their teachers, their peers, to staying at home all the time, and being around, their family, which for some children that can be a great thing. There might be a great dynamic between themselves and their family members, but for other, children, they might not have the best relationship, right, with family members. So that is another thing that, could have affected, the mental health of these children as well.
And yes, Sarah, I love what you said about it was a time of reflection, right? We were all kind of forced to kind of sit in this thing, and it was kind of out of our control. And for some, especially for me, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder years ago. And people who already have a mental health diagnosis, control is something that we kind of struggle with, right? And for me, I was used to being in control of situations, but ultimately we know we don't have any control. God ultimately has the control. However, it makes you feel good to know to some degree that you do have a shoe in to what is happening in your life. And so that is what happened with me during the pandemic. I lost my job in 2020 because of the pandemic. I was getting ready to start a new position. I was so excited. And I said, oh my goodness, yes, this will give me an opportunity to, travel. And this will give me an opportunity, to kind of really truly be involved in something that I feel would, continue to make a difference. However, pandemic had other plans and God had other plans. And so my position was taken away because of the pandemic, and it caused me to not have an income for 3 to 4 months. And I speak on that because I feel like there are a lot of families out there who were affected by the pandemic financially. And you think to yourself, you think of those Maslow's, hierarchy, right, of needs. And you think about that and you say, well, we know our basic needs have to be met in order for us to fulfill other things or, focus on other things. But when that's not fulfilled, you're kind of in survival mode. And it definitely does affect your mental health. So for me, financially trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to provide, for my children, a fear of if I'm going to have a job, because how long is this pandemic going to last, right? And what does that look like for my children? Because I love my children. However, I kind of like my autonomy too. I like that independent part as a parent to be able to go, and work and have that adult time and not feel like I'm constantly, with my kids 24/7. And I'm sure they felt the same way. And so it definitely caused my anxiety to become more severe. And it definitely caused depression, because you feel kind of that hopelessness, like, okay, what is going to truly happen with this situation, with this pandemic? Is this going to be like this forever? And that's the thing about mental health. What is mental health? We know mental health is the way we receive things, the way we act, our behavior, our emotions and our mental state, right? That is mental health and our overall well-being. And with the pandemic, if you can imagine me as a parent, how I felt in that moment, not knowing what was going to happen. Children are really a mirror of us. They're a mirror of the parents, and they feel energy, right? They feel what their parents feel. So I didn't understand with my youngest son why he was, having tantrums and having meltdowns until I had to realize, wait a minute, he feels what I'm feeling. I'm stressed. I'm anxious. I have a lot going on. So I cannot even imagine how he is feeling. So, that right there, I think as adults, we focus so much on how we're feeling, but we forget that children, even though they are resilient, even though children adapt well, they are still human, just like we are, and they feel those emotions just like we do, and it affects them as well.
Yeah, Candace, that's a very good point that you made there. So what I found very much similar to what Candace was saying is that sort of the mental health of a child, as much as it comes from the direct experience that they're experiencing, it trickles down from the parents. So what Candace was saying earlier is that, the parents are the mirror for the child, right? So they see and they observe how the parent, presents in life, and they sort of mirror that behavior or that state of being, right? And this pandemic, a perfect example of that, right? So I think there have been, I'm sure, some families where, parents necessarily, didn't take the absolute best care of themselves, either because they have children and they're putting the needs of others before themselves, or, work, or whatever it is. And, once this quarantine hit, I think the kids, were on the same wavelength of the parents, in the sense of the parents started realizing that, okay, like, this is how I'm feeling. This is, what I'm presenting with. Either I want to get healthy, or, I'm noticing I'm feeling sad. And the kids pick up on it. Like Candace was saying earlier, right? Kids are incredibly bright, incredibly intuitive. They understand more than we think. And so it's definitely not easy for them if they see, a parent or family member struggling. Their innate, nature would be to experience that, or sort of like reflect that back within themselves. So I think there had to be, and Candace can talk more about this, is there had to be changes, I think, from the top of this hierarchy down, right? So before, even addressing, mental health in children, I think there needed to be some conversation about, well, what's the mental health of the household? How is the household, functioning right now, right? Because when the kids were in school, right, they're gone for, 7-8 hours, whatever it is, and the parents is either working, or they're working from home, or, so typically while the kids are in school, they're not at home. But when they were placed in this quarantine, everybody's at home now. So now, in addition to just, the parents and their, situation, there's throwing in the kids being at home all the time. And I think a lot of parents had to sort of realize and step into the fact that, I have to take care of myself and my mental health first before, I try to help and support anybody else, even my children, right? Because I think a lot of parents, they have this unconditional love for their kids, and they would do anything for their child. But essentially, at the end of the day, if you as a parent are not filling yourself up and taking care of yourself, you can't take care and help your child as much as you want to. You need to be there for you first, physically, mentally, spiritually, all the needs first, before you can go and, help your kids. So I think, Candace, you can add more on that, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. What you said, Sarah, we definitely have to fill up our cups first before we fill up anybody. And again, in order to do that, that's a whole different look. That's another topic. When we talk about boundaries, we talk about, so man, we can talk about a lot. However, I love what you said, Sarah, about the parent making sure that they are okay, right, for their children. And that is something in that pandemic that I learned. Candace was not putting herself first, right? I was putting everybody else before myself. And what that pandemic did, like you talked about, it gave everybody an opportunity to reflect and really be introspective and think about things. And it kind of forced, a lot of people to look inward. And so what it did for me was it forced me to try to relinquish that control that I was having, to understand, wait a minute, I don't have any control over these things that are happening. I don't know what's going to happen. So, but I know if I'm not okay, my children are not okay. And I have to do something to make sure that I try to hold this household together. So what I did was I seek therapy. And I was so excited that I did do that because what therapy helped me to do was truly to cope with what was happening in the pandemic, and also to learn, creative and fun ways to really stay mindful and stay in the present moment and not get so focused on the future or the past, but to try my best to stay into what was happening in the now. And that definitely helped me, to really lower my anxiety. And I definitely found hope, again, in the situation. And so in turn, what happened was my children, began to feel better, right? And I think that's important to know, parents out there. When you feel better, your children feel better. Okay. That's just, I don't know what that's about, but it goes like that. And so I wanted to kind of touch on a few things with the pandemic and families and parents, because everybody kind of had a different kind of scenario, right? My scenario was my children were at home with me, and I was able to be with them, even though, I lost my job. I'm sure that's others' story as well. However, there are a lot of other different scenarios. Some people still had to work. Some people still had to work in the pandemic and be at home with their child. So you can imagine a parent working and still trying to supervise and look over their child as they're doing online school. And then there were even some who went hybrid, right? What does that mean, hybrid? That means they went to school for 2 or 3 days, and then they came home and did the rest online. You can imagine that was very challenging for parents who had to work. And also you think about those parents whose background may not have been in education. I was blessed, that's my background, but you think about those parents who they're like, okay, that is what the teacher is for, right? To be able to teach my child. And I would try my best, but that is challenging for me, to do. So you think about how that affected not only the parent, but the child, as well. You think about the scenarios where there was a family member who became sick, with COVID, and kind of what that looked like, going through that stress, of a loved one being sick, or even a loved one who, they had to be hospitalized, or the trauma of that. That's traumatic. First of all, let's say this, the pandemic is traumatic. Okay. We're still in the pandemic. I mean, it's not over. It's not. And it's very traumatic. So you add on all of those other factors, right? That makes that trauma even more heavy. And so you have families who, maybe there are some children who got their food from going to school, right? That's where they were able to get a balanced meal at, was at school. So coming home, and especially the pandemic causing people to have financial, concerns, hardships, maybe that child is not eating, properly the way they could. And so that's affecting, them as well. You think about just it's so many factors that go in with the pandemic. And so those are just a few, but you just imagine how that affects a child if they're not getting the proper, nutrition, their diet, okay? If they are if they already have a mental health diagnosis, let's talk about that too. If a child already has a mental health diagnosis and they're not able to go and get the treatment they need because they're forced to be at home, okay? And let's say their family dynamic is already traumatic. Let's say they're in an abusive, situation with their family. You can imagine what that's doing to their mental health. Is it decreasing it? No, you better believe it's not. It's increasing that trauma for them. And so that right there is super heavy again in itself. It's just so many factors. And so mental health in children was definitely affected in families by the pandemic, for sure.
Absolutely. And so once, the children, their mental health is affected, that also then translates right into academics and how they perform, not only in school, but just how they show up in society. So as a tutor myself, I kind of got to experience that firsthand, during the pandemic, because like Candice was saying, there are so many factors that go into, affecting a child's mental health, right? The typical stress, family dynamic, add on, pandemic, quarantine, not being able to see friends, loved ones passing away, all of these things, play a role. And again, on top of children who have, mental health conditions already, that just adds on to it. And now all of these things translate into academic performance. So I found that, the children that had, mental health being affected very severely throughout this pandemic academically, it was more challenging for them. So mental health, as we know today, affects everything that goes on, right, in our body, mind, spirit, everything is connected. So when someone even says, my mental health is suffering, it's not just the mental health. The mental health is suffering, and that then affects your physical health, that then affects how you eat, that affects, so everything is all connected. It's not, just mental health. So it becomes, passed down through different things. And so once the mental health, is affected, like Candice was saying, like that affects nutrition, that affects all these things. And in academics, right, being in school, when the kids were in school, they were in school for 7-8 hours a day, which is a long time. That's a separate topic altogether, right? But, being able to focus on a task and focus on something like academics that involves a lot of, critical thinking and analyzing, you definitely need to be, fueled well, and you definitely need to be in the right mindset, right? Even pre-pandemic, right? If you are not in the mindset to do school, it's very difficult to do school. I'm sure, we've all had that experience, either as parents, children, no matter what, right? If you don't have that mindset, like, okay, I'm going to sit down and do my homework's not going to get done. So it's definitely, with all of these things and factors that affect the mental health, it becomes difficult for the child to sit down and focus, right? And do all this, lessons and homework and things like that. And that's sort of where I come in, for families that, were able to, reach out or connect with a tutor or some other resources that were either available through the school. They were able to get that individual help for their child. But, there are some families that definitely, they couldn't do that. It wasn't, financially within the budget. It wasn't accessible or available to them, depending on, which school they were at. that is definitely a challenge too. And so I think also the actual academics, this is an important topic here, like the actual academics that were being taught in the pandemic were not up to par. And I think that also affects the child's mental health, right? So a lot of the children that were, either virtual or hybrid, like Candice was saying, it's a whole new learning style, right? And so every child has their learning style and the best way that they, process information and things like that. Now, there are some children that can pick up to a quick change. So going from, being in person to virtual learning, there are some children that, have this transition seamlessly, but then there are other children where it is more of a problem and it's not as easy for them to transition. And especially, I personally think hybrid is the most challenging in terms of transitioning, because you're sort of like 50-50, like one leg in one situation. And you're not exactly, like, you can't even transition to one thing. It's sort of, you're still in person and you're kind of virtual, but you're not completely in person. So it's very difficult in that case to sort of adapt and get your mind right for that. And the teachers, their role sort of in this whole pandemic, right, they had to adapt as well in terms of, teaching and being available for the students. And, in some cases, this is, a big shout out to the educators that had to step up and play, a huge role, not only in teaching, but some educators had to play even the role of the parent and some of these other roles, for the children where their needs were not being met at home. So it was definitely a big thing for them to take that on, during this pandemic, and fulfill that for the parents and the guardians that couldn't. So that's a very big thing. So what I was saying before, the mental health translates into the academic performance, and it's all connected, right? So that if one thing kind of isn't being addressed, the other thing sort of drops. It's sort of like a scales, right? Like those justice scales. If one side is not exactly balanced, the other sort of flip-flops. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true, Sarah. And I love how you gave that kind of overview of, okay, it's not just affecting children, it's not just affecting parents, right? It's affecting teachers, educators as well. The pandemic affected everybody. So we know kind of what that looks like from a parent perspective. We know what it looks like at home, right? From a family perspective. And now we're going into what that looks like in the education system and in the schools, and how it did affect the teachers and kind of what that looks like for children academically. So you have to think about those children who were in the pandemic. So I happen to have that experience with the children who came in to the school not going to preschool. Why didn't they go to preschool? They didn't go to preschool because of the pandemic. The pandemic caused them, of course, to have to stay home, and unfortunately missed out on that education, that teaching. And some were taught at home. Let's make that clear. Some were taught at home, and that's not judging. That's not a person who, didn't get taught at home. Is there anything wrong with that? No, because like I had said earlier, unfortunately, that is not everyone's skill set, right? That's not everyone's, background. So I definitely understand that was challenging for some. But what that did was you have some students who, when it was time to return back to school, some who were on grade level, and you had some who were a little above grade level, and then you had some that were very, very behind. So what that does is cause a lot of stress on the teacher, because now the teacher has to differentiate, a lot of the lessons, a lot of the activities, to truly cater to everyone, right? And is it possible? Yes, it's very possible with support. And we kind of talked about that in the first episode about kind of what that looks like with support. But we're talking about, of course, the mental health right now and how it affects academics. So you have these students who missed out on kind of those precursors, right? They missed out on those things that they needed in order to meet the requirements of being in school. So because of the pandemic, what did the pandemic do? It caused education systems to be more lenient. It caused more education systems to kind of throw out a lot of rules and regulations. So in other instances where students would have to meet, certain criteria and certain qualifications, that was out the window because of the pandemic. So you have these students now in school who are really struggling. I mean, academically, they're really, really struggling because they did not get those prereqs. They did not get those things that they needed in order to be on level. And so what does that do? Okay, that causes confidence issues, that causes a lot of anxiety as well with some students who have never been in school before. They've never, ever been in school, and now they're in school, especially after enduring such a traumatic event, the pandemic, where they were in the house, most of the time. They didn't interact with peers. Some don't even have those social skills because they never experienced it because of the pandemic. So you're going into this new environment and this new situation, and you're feeling overwhelmed. I can imagine as a child, it is extremely overwhelming when you've been with just your parent, for so long. And now all of a sudden you're in this environment with all of these students. And I'll tell you the grade level I'm talking about, everyone. I'm talking about kindergarten. I'm talking about kindergarten right now. And so you can imagine a child comes in, to an environment and they don't know anyone. They don't have those social skills. They don't have that emotional development, because we all know in preschool, what are those things that are taught? You're being taught those self-adaptive skills. You're being taught that emotional development, social development, and you're even building on that cognitive development, right? So when you don't have those things, you're coming into kindergarten, and it's almost like you're at the preschool level. And so that definitely plays a lot, on a child. And you think of those children who lost a loved one from the pandemic. That's extremely traumatic. They're grieving. They're coming into a situation in school where they're dealing with that grief, and what does grief cause? It causes anger, it causes apathy, it causes anxiety, it causes nightmares. I mean, it's so many things that it can cause. And that affects the mental health, as well. You have some students who they didn't see their parents that often during the pandemic because their parents were on call at the hospital. I mean, they had to, be on their job. So they didn't get an opportunity to really spend that much time, or they had to stay away from their parents because of COVID. They couldn't really be around their parents, and that's traumatic. So a lot of things took place. And then you think about the teachers, right? From the teacher's perspective. So I'm going to school and I have a fear when I come home, I don't want to bring that to my family, or I don't want to get it. You think about the fear that is in the teachers, every day, or thinking about a student. I don't want to give, anything to a student, and vice versa. And especially the mask. Oh my goodness. Wearing the mask, that right there is heavy. You really think about that. What does that look like for children with communication? Maybe if they have speech deficits, right? Or they have a speech delay, what does that look like? Are they able to truly articulate, or you hear what they're saying, because we have to keep what? A mask on. So they may have a speech delay and you may not even notice, or maybe they don't, and it sounds like they do, a lot of children, of course, have, I don't know, it's truly affected them in a lot of ways. And that's what I love about the holistic part, right? That's where the holistic part kind of comes in, to truly understand the well-being of the child, the overall well-being of the child. And we talk about trauma, a lot, but trauma is real, and trauma is not just abuse. Trauma is not just neglect, okay? Trauma can be environmental stresses. Trauma can be academics. Trauma can be, the pandemic. That was trauma, okay? I mean, trauma looks like a lot of different things, and you can imagine how it affects adults. You can imagine how the pandemic affected us. I mean, it's unreal. I think a lot of us have never experienced anything like this before. And it's historical, and it brought a lot of uncertainty. So if we are feeling all of this, children, it's very difficult for them to truly express themselves, right? We talk about that part of the brain where it's very challenging for them to express themselves the way an adult can. So you can imagine what that looks like in a child when they're trying to express their needs, their wants. What do you think that looks like? That's acting out. That's having anger outbursts. That's having meltdowns. That's having crying spells. That's not having interest in things. That's hitting another student. That's being silent, not saying anything, being inward. It looks like a lot of different things. And what it is, it's mental health, right? It's a deep thing. It is.
Yeah, I love Candace, what you shared. So Candace, especially, she touched on, right, the transition of the younger children, especially, right, those that didn't experience education prior to the pandemic. And then once the pandemic started to taper a little bit, were able to begin, right, like kindergarten and age groups like that. But what I want to touch on is actually, this is a spectrum, right? So I'm basically the children that or the young adults, I should say, that just finished high school and had to transition to college. So that, I think, is another huge transition. It's a little bit different, right? Because these young adults have had experience in education, but their transition to college is a big one too, because they're going from an environment where a lot of things were perhaps handed to them, right? College is a big transition in, the education system, where typically students first learn to be independent, with their own education, not just, with, things like nutrition and, their individual lifestyles, but also education. And so that, I think, those students, those children in particular, once they had this pandemic come into play and they had to begin college, I think it affected them drastically, right? Because not only are they now finishing an education system that they were most likely comfortable in, right? All these years of schooling, they had a teacher or multiple teachers for every subject, and they knew that when they would go into a class, they would get this homework and this project, and it would be due this certain day. They're going from that environment to an environment where, there's lecture maybe once or twice a week. No one is telling you how to study, when to study, when to do your homework. All of these things are very much something that each student has to, experience and figure out, right? And, some students choose to go to a college that's away from home, right? And that during the pandemic is a huge, stress for these children, these students, right? Because they could be worrying about, family back at home, they don't know anybody perhaps in the new college if they're, entering incoming freshmen. They're trying to meet people and develop this social interaction, but they really can't, right? Because of the restrictions of this pandemic, right? A lot of, on-campus activities and clubs and events where, students can meet other students on the college campuses, they had to be canceled or they had to be virtual. And that affects the students too, right? Because a big aspect of college, outside of, a great education is the social environment. A lot of students choose to go to college, for that social interaction, meeting people from, different parts of, the country or different parts of the world, depending on where you go. And having that be translated into necessarily a, looking at a computer screen, for an event, it's not the same thing. And mentally that definitely takes a toll on the student, right? Because if they're coming into this college where they don't know anybody and they want to make friends, they can't exactly meet people or get to know them through a computer screen. It's a completely different environment. So there's definitely that aspect. And just the whole aspect of the students in college or incoming students in college trying to balance everything out, right? Kind of what I was saying earlier, there's no one holding your hand in college. You are very much on your own in terms of making sure that academically, your needs are met, emotionally, that you have, yourself taken care of and all these things. And something I personally want to touch on, is the mental health resources that are found on a college campus. Now, a disclaimer that I, want to kind of share is those, vary school to school, right? So there isn't really a distinct standard that every, university or college follows with the same amount of resources, for all different kinds of people and different kinds of mental health conditions per se. So it definitely depends on where you go. And from my personal experience, I went to a city school. So budgets were financially tight. And this is even before the pandemic, right? And you can imagine with the pandemic, there's even less budget available for the university, even to use on resources like mental health. And it's unfortunate because we know the need for these resources is through the roof, right? It exponentially is needed, but there aren't enough resources available to these students. And again, they're in this transition where they're trying to figure stuff out again. It's almost like going back to pre-K, to kindergarten, right? Because you're again sort of trying to find your footing. You're like the little fish in a big pond again. So it's these resources, again, they're not available to, unfortunately, to all students. And I know this was incredibly difficult because what Candace was saying earlier about, she was able to, participate in therapy, and that's amazing if you are able to do that, right? From a financial standpoint or just time and all of these things. But for, a lot of the students that go to university don't have that ability where they can enroll in therapy or, things like that. And they rely on the school, the mental health resources, which are usually free most of the time, but they're not, you're not meeting with a psychiatrist. So in terms of, students that have mental health conditions that are on, medications to support them with that, they can't help them in that regard. They can, help them with holding space and more of just being a third person to support them and kind of, what they're going through. So that is something that, is to keep in mind as well, the mental health there. And again, some schools have been, I should say, better at it than others. It depends on where you go, but the need for those students to sort of have someone to talk to is definitely increased incredibly throughout this pandemic. So that's one thing I kind of wanted to mention on that. The other note is a little bit different is, Candace kind of talked about the role of the teachers and, how their mental health has been affected, right? In terms of, being concerned for themselves, their families, and their students in terms of their health and well-being because of the nature of this pandemic being, involving health, right? But also the amount of stress that they're put under, in order to present their role to the best of their ability, right? Because I think a lot of educators that choose to, pursue education and make it their career, your heart is usually with the children. You really care about those that you impact, whether it's, young adults that you're teaching or young, kindergartners. Your heart is, with the children, and you really do develop a relationship where you really truly care. And in this pandemic, I know a lot of educators have, they will do anything for their students, and they want to make sure that, their sort of education that they're providing for the students is up to par, right? It's, even though, like Candace was mentioning earlier, that a lot of the standards have been sort of thrown out the window. I know here in New York State, the state testing that happens every year, that was gone. And a lot of students, that, had the test been in place might not have moved on to the next grade level. Those children were moved on anyway, and they sort of had to pick up the slack, not necessarily just the children, but their future teachers. And, it's a difficult transition. But at the same time, I also want to mention on the flip side, I've experienced, working with children one-to-one, there have been a lot of instances where there have been educators that sort of haven't played their role to the best of their ability, I should say. So there's a lot of educators that, having the standards thrown out the window, they sort of put their hands up and kind of gave up on the children, right? Which is unfortunate, because education, something that both Candace and I are passionate about, is not just how important education is, but how accessible it should be to everyone, to all children. It's such an integral part of development, and just, it's so important. And so the fact that there have been teachers that sort of, took it upon themselves to, not provide the learning that was required of them for the child then, suffers. And not only academically, of course, right? Because once they move on to the next grade level or the next topic, they're left with gaps that, the next teacher or the parent has to pick up the pieces, whoever it has to be. But also mentally, right? There's this concept of comparison, right? In today's society nowadays, even amongst the children, especially in rigid structures like schools, there's a lot of comparisons where peers tend to compare themselves to each other, right? It's unfortunately became sort of like involuntary. It just sort of happens naturally, right? When you're in an environment with a whole bunch of other people and you're all doing the same thing, you sort of can't help but compare to your neighbor or to the person to the left or right of you, right? And this is one of the many things that I think is challenging about having these school systems the way they are now, is that, all of the kids in the classroom have to be taught the same information, the same way, the same time, all of this. And so this comparison becomes very, very difficult very quickly. So a lot of kids really like to pick on, other students, or sort of have this superiority complex almost a little bit, where, if they have a friend that, like, let's say got an 80 on a test and they got like a 96, they're, up in that, friend's grill and telling them off that, like, hey, I'm so much smarter than you, and I did this XYZ. And that hurts, right? Like every child and every student has, feelings, right? Because we're all human. But I think it's a different dynamic between having this comparison from a peer versus, a teacher or a parent or someone comparing you, right? So when, academically things are not to the level that they should be, where the educator is not providing in the way they should be, the students might have this comparison going on, which is what I had experienced personally, because I tend to work with a lot of families, right? So there's, let's say 3 children in one family, and even if they're all on 3 different grade levels, I started to see during this time, during the pandemic, that the children would start comparing to each other. The siblings would compare to each other, even though they're at a completely different grade level. Their, expectations to different standards are they're all different, right? But they still, desire to be better, or desire to know more than their sibling, right? And that's heavy. That's really heavy, right? Because there's, living in a family with siblings, there is that, level of competition that sort of is innate, right? As humans, we have this ability of like comparison. But add to that, the pandemic and, academics not being taught equally and being stuck at home and only being surrounded by your family members, you have this, comparison going on, and that definitely affects the children and their mental health, so that's super important to keep in mind. And this is something that, might have been handled better perhaps if schools focused more on an individual based learning, right? And this is something Candace and I briefly touched upon in our previous video, but it's a difficult topic to it's a difficult can of worms to open. Yeah, but so that is one thing that I wanted to say on teaching with the educators really not stepping in to the level they should. And again, this is not all educators, but there is this perspective that I did want to shed some light on, because while we do have a lot of amazing and wonderful educators, there are definitely some that, their interest is not the children primarily, so there are these educators that, truth be told, come in for a paycheck, leave and go home, but don't really care about if they have 1 student, 51 students, 101 students in front of them. It doesn't matter. And it's sad, because those students and those children are the ones that suffer. And academically, as I've mentioned, an episode or 2 back, that once there are gaps academically or even in mental health, this is important too. Once there's an experience and a child, is affected, if that is not addressed immediately, that gap just grows and grows and grows. It doesn't shrink, right? Just because, one event stops. If this pandemic was to stop today, and something else would happen in life, everything wouldn't just disappear, right? Just because life goes on. Actually, what happens is things grow and grow and populate, right? Unless we sort of handle them head on. So these academic gaps and these, gaps in mental health, and what I mean by gaps in mental health is that, if a child experiences a stress, right? And a stress, like I mentioned, last episode, is any environment in which your body, mind, spirit cannot handle, right? A stress can be as simple as you fall walking on the street, right? You falling, that stress is because your body is not prepared to handle that environment, which is you walking, right? So it can be as simple as that. It can be as extreme and as severe and as traumatic, right, as the pandemic itself, right? Because the pandemic itself is a huge stress, and that can affect the mental health, as we know. So if those gaps, those experiences are not processed either by the child with a professional, right, a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, with a parent, maybe teacher, if those aren't processed, right, it stays in your body, right? From the holistic perspective, right, anything that you don't process immediately in your body stays there, and it gets really, really, really bad over time, right? Until something else happens to you that sort of adds to that experience, right? So it's sort of like, God knocking at your door. And first it's like something little, then it's like, a brick on your head, then it's, something else that like knocks you out completely, right? So those children really, they benefit from all these resources that, could be and should be provided to sort of mitigate those gaps in mental health and academically too.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, absolutely what you said when it comes to being burnt out with the mental health in the pandemic, it definitely can cause burnout in a teacher, in families and students. So you kind of look at what the mental health and the pandemic does, in the education system with families coming back into the school system. You almost have to tell yourself, well, does something have to shift? Does something have to change when it comes to that curriculum? Do we go about things the same way? And the question is, no. You're not going to go about things the same way, because life will never be the same way as we know it. And we have to kind of educate based on the needs of children, the needs of families, and where it meets the needs of teachers as well. And so what Sarah was talking about on a holistic standpoint, holistically speaking, we do need to tap into what does education look like to help children socially? What does education look like to help children emotionally? What does education look like to help children with trauma, with meeting those needs as far as their mental health? And I love what Sarah said about let's not forget about those students who are in high school or who are transitioning into college or who are in college. They are still, students as well. And that is important to kind of talk about what the pandemic did for them and how it affected them as well. So I'm happy Sarah touched on that, because it affected all students, okay? It affected all families. It affected all educators. I think the point of all of this and what we're talking about is, okay, what does that look like moving forward? What does that look like for parents? What are some signs for all you parents out there, for all you educators out there, for anyone listening to this podcast? What are signs to look for when there is a child displaying or exhibiting, right, those behaviors or the mental health, showing that they have mental health needs? Well, number one, what you're going to look for is how they're acting, how they're interacting with others. When there is a student who is showing healthy, positive mental health, they are positive. They're very optimistic. They're very positive. They enjoy interacting with others. They're resilient. What does that mean to be resilient? That means even when something happens to them, or they get their feelings hurt, or something happens, they bounce back quickly, right? They're resilient. And they're curious about the world. They ask questions. They want to know things. And they're persistent. They keep going, with the flow and what's happening. And so they're showing that they emotionally have, a healthy well-being mentally, and the way they act is important. Now, how do you see a student who may not be showing positive mental health? They may have challenges, right? Interacting with their peers. They may be overly sensitive. And when we talk about overly sensitive, let's talk about that, because I'm a sensitive person, okay? And I love being a sensitive person. But when I talk about being overly sensitive, I mean, even a student saying, well, Miss Smith, you didn't call on me, and you were ignoring me. You didn't care about me. And they shut down for the rest of the day. That is what I mean by being overly sensitive, okay? And not only that, not necessarily that I didn't call on them, then we had to move on, right, to another lesson. So that's what I mean by being oversensitive. Another one is having a meltdown, having a tantrum, feeling overwhelmed very quickly, or having an angry outburst. Even we say Incredible Hulk, turn it into Incredible Hulk. 1 minute you're good, and the next minute it's like, you're all over the place, right? That definitely is something to look for. Lack of focus. It's very challenging for the child to truly focus on one thing. They kind of seem like they're all over the place. And lack of motivation. They're really not motivated to do much. They never really want to learn. They never really want to, be involved in activities, or they have a negative self-talk. What is negative self-talk? Negative self-talk is saying those things, I can't. No, I'm not smart. I'm not good at that. I don't want to do that. No, call on somebody else. Those are things to look for. And those are just a few things, right? To look for with that, or even picky eating. I will talk about, and that's another episode with the nutrition, but even picky eating, that's something. Do they not have an interest in eating anymore? Or did their appetite change? That's something to look for. So for parents and educators out there, those are just a few things to look for when you're trying to understand, is there some anxiety happening? Is there, some things going on with the mental health? And so it's very important for everyone to really hear this and understand, to be very cognizant and very understanding and open-minded to the pandemic and how it has affected children and students and families and everyone, and to truly come up with a plan. Like Sarah said, it needs to be individualized, right? An individualized plan to come together to meet the needs of the students. And what does that look like? That looks like a holistic plan. What is holistic? Holistic is really tapping into not just the academics, but every aspect of the child on that mental, emotional, social, nutritional, all levels, spiritual, all levels, is very important to make sure that child, of course, is getting that holistic education. And, just to give some things to you all, Sarah is a tutor. A holistic tutor. I'm a holistic tutor, okay? And what we specialize in, I'll speak for me. Sorry, Sarah. What I specialize in tutoring, students ages 5 to 11 years of age who are experiencing those things, and really helping them to resolve, those concerns, or those needs, to help them to have more of a healthy mindset, okay, so that they can thrive academically. And so I definitely know that this is a movement that's happening, and education is changing, before our eyes. And I feel like you all can agree with that. With everything that has taken place, it's kind of forced us to take a different direction and not go by the status quo, but to go by what is truly beneficial for children, for families, for educators, and to all kind of be on the same page and just be open, to the truth.
Absolutely. I completely agree, Candace. And what I wanted to say on that note is another resource that I wouldn't necessarily call it a resource per se, but kind of touches back to the fact that we were saying, right, children and students learn and take on and mirror from those that they interact with, right? So their families, their educators, their peers. So having their people that they interact closely with, so their parents and their educators, having that conversation open and having those people in their life share about how they're feeling, what they're experiencing, also allows for that open-ended conversation with the children sharing how they are feeling, right? Because kind of what Candace was touching on earlier, right? This children and the students that are able to communicate that either verbally or through their actions, right? And of course, like Candace was saying earlier, the children that show that disengagement, right, from tasks, or just you're able to tell. So every individual and every child, right, should be, if there's any comparison, it should be to themselves, right? So when you're looking at a child individually, and you're trying to see how their mental health is, you want to compare that to their normal state, right? By normal, I mean their everyday tendency. What was that like when they're doing just a daily task? For the parents, getting out of bed, going about their morning, getting ready for school. For the educators, it's seeing the children, how are they in class? Are they attentive? Are they down? Are they, laying on their desk? Are they raising their hand? Are they participating? All of those things is something that we can see, right? But for the kids that are either a nonverbal altogether, right? Because there are students, that are nonverbal, and for them, it's even more challenging, right? Because they're experiencing these mental health stressors just like everyone else, but they aren't able to communicate that as easily, right? So part of that is, the people that they interact with need to have that awareness of, sort of what are they trying to tell you, and sort of pay attention to their cues, right? Because communication doesn't only have to be with words and with actions, right? There can be different hand movements and gestures that also can be a way of sort of sign language for those that use it, as well as another form of communication where, a child or a student can, tell you how they're feeling, right? So that's very important, right? To wherever you have children or students in the classroom or at home, to have an environment in which the child or student feels safe to talk about and express themselves fully without knowing that they're going to be judged either by the parent or by the educator, right? That it's safe for me to, tell my teacher that today's not a good day, that, today I just need to rest and not participate as much. It's like one of those days, right? So safety in the environment is key for the child and student to be able to share, right, how they're feeling, and for the teachers, too, to incorporate that in some way, right, in their classroom, to have either like a daily check-in, either like on a wall maybe, or something where they can check in with every student, and like, today I'm feeling, and different stickers, maybe even like for happy a different color, for sad, just to have that communication on both ends. So sometimes, children might feel pressured, right, to talk or speak. I know I was one of those children when I was 5, right? I was selectively mute, so I didn't talk in school. And I know that those individuals like myself that had selective mutism, if they were sort of directed a question one-to-one, they were even less likely to share what was going on. Like it's almost as if they're being attacked, right? So for those individuals, right, there's a way of sort of, you know, asking more in a group setting, maybe when they're, you know, surrounded by their peers and they're, you know, having recess or free time where they don't feel like they're just being attacked or targeted there. So again, like just this is one resource that, you know, open-ended conversation in the environment, right, with the children. So that's one resource. Another, of course, like we mentioned earlier, is, you know, the facilitators for mental health, right? So whatever that is, depending on the case, right? The psychiatrist, the school social worker, the psychologist, the parent there, whoever is on their support team, to make sure that those resources are available. And in schools, in public schools, they usually are available for free, both in, you know, elementary, middle, high school, but also in university. There are some resources depending on where you go. For those that are not, there are some resources that are available, and I'm actually, at the end of this video, I'm going to link them in the description of the video. I'm going to have a little list of different resources that anyone who needs them, if you're looking, or, you know, those will be available for you as well.
Very nice. I love that. See, you come to this podcast and you get resources, okay, to help you. I love it. But no, I love what you said, Sarah, about the daily check-ins. Even as an adult, I love a daily check-in, okay? Because what that does is it helps me to know, okay, that I have a space, and my daily check-in are, of course, with friends like you, Sarah, and when I go to therapy, an opportunity to really just express how I'm feeling, get things out. And for children, that is important because they can't always verbalize, like you said, what is going on. And it could even be something as, you know, easy, like you said, a sticker. If it's an emoji sticker, are you happy today? Are you sad today? Are you excited? Are you cool? Are you calm? You know, something like that, just so they can express how they're feeling. And what that does is that definitely takes that stress and it takes whatever burden that they're having off of them. And just like Sarah has said before, we know when we're feeling things in our body that can affect us physically. So it is important to do that. And I love what Sarah said, for parents can do this, teachers, you know, to have a daily check-in with your child, and even have a daily check-in, you know, as an adult, you know, with your peers. That's an awesome thing, you know, to do. And just making sure that your mental health is, you know, at the top, you know, of your list. It's important to really recognize, you know, those things with your mental health and understand your resources and understand that there are supports and there, you know, people out there and places out there to really help, you know, to help you with your mental health, and especially with the children. There is therapy. They have family therapy. They also have holistic tutoring. They have, you know, energy readers. They have, I mean, it's so many different holistic things out there for you all to tap into, because I know even for me, right, it's been a journey, and I'm sure Sarah can attest to this as well. It has definitely been a journey, kind of changing that mindset and being more holistic. And for those who are listening and watching, you know, to understand that being holistic, to me, what I define being holistic as truly doing those things that are going to nurture your whole body in a natural way. That's how I see holistic, and what better way to do things that are natural to help you and help your child to really succeed, because when your mental health is when intervention happens early with mental health in children grow up to be very healthy adults. Their mental health is much healthier. So it is important to really make sure that the mental health is being managed, as a child. It boosts their confidence. And when your confidence is boosted, you're more open, right, to take risks. You're more open to take risks and do things and be more successful. So it is important. And, that's why we're talking about these things, just so you all can have awareness about it, and just know that there are, a lot of resources and supports out there. I love that Sarah's going to link those things for you all. I really hope that you all enjoyed this podcast. I know I did. Sarah, I know, did you?
Absolutely.
And we're excited, and we look forward to you all checking out the YouTube channel. Subscribe also, so you can hear more episodes to come. Yeah.